and welcome. This is Business Edge on News Central. I'm Tolulokwe Adileru Balogun. Today is a really special show that we have for you because the focus of today's show is on entrepreneurship, whether it is the future of African entrepreneurship, and even looking at a book that focuses on entrepreneurs across the continent, the lessons they've learned, and what we can do to make the future of Africa as a continent bigger and brighter. I have a very special guest in the studio with me, but you'll get to meet him after this. Right now, let's take a quick look at how the stock markets, both here on the continent and outside of Africa, are shaping up. So a quick check on the stock markets, both here on the continent and outside. So straight into it, our headlines, as we normally do, the future of African entrepreneurship, and a look at Sango Dele's Making Futures. And that is a very special book that highlights the story of many entrepreneurs, about hundreds of them across the continent. We'll get into all of that when we come back after this quick break. As usual, welcome. This is Business Edge. So joining me on the show today, I have a serial Pan-African entrepreneur, investor, as well as author, Sango Dele, and we'll be getting into the future of African entrepreneurship, as well as a few insights from his book, which was put together talking to hundreds of entrepreneurs across the continent, and also seeing exactly what makes them tick and how we can make sure that the future of entrepreneurship is bright. Sango, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
All right, so let's get into our first part of the conversation. Now, a 2013 Brookings Institute study revealed that African youth between the ages of 15 and 24 years constitute about 37% of the working age population. Now, this same age group, however, account for about 60% of joblessness right here on the continent. With a majority of African countries diversifying from traditional income sources, entrepreneurship is increasingly seen as a key to economic growth. So far, it has yielded significant returns, and according to experts, there lies great untapped potential to drive the African continent into its next phase of development. Many African entrepreneurs, however, face a number of challenges, with a lack of access to capital and an enabling environment presenting huge loopholes to the success of their ventures. So let's start with that as part of our conversation. Now, Sango, I asked you this question off air, so I'll keep it in terms of who's getting it right on the continent. But what we see is that across the continent, many African countries and economies are struggling to get it right when it comes to entrepreneurship. And you see that entrepreneurs are facing access to capital issues, electricity issues, transportation issues, even an enabling environment. Taxation is also an issue that we're facing. Out of all of these things, why does it seem that Africa has not been able to get a handle on really firing up the engine of entrepreneurship for the continent?
Right. So, I mean, what you say is very important here, in that it's not just about, too often policymakers and government talk about entrepreneurship and it's become a buzzword.
Yes.
Right, but a couple of things, caveats. The first is we over-romanticize entrepreneurship, right? So this idea that every poor person or every unemployed youth is an entrepreneur just waiting to come out of their shell and do something, it's actually harmful, because most people just want jobs.
Please, I need you to repeat that, because even on social media, I'll just a quick segue, even on social media, you see a number of young people who feel that if they're having a typical 9-to-5 and they're getting paid a salary, they're getting paid for someone else's dreams to come true, that if they're not an entrepreneur, they're somehow failing.
Right. I think the discourse around entrepreneurship has over-glorified it, right? That said, entrepreneurship will be critical to our future. It will be one of many policy tools that we need. We have 12 million young people entering the labor force in Africa every year, and they only meet 3 million jobs.
Yeah.
Right? That deficit
is massive.
It's massive, and it's growing every year because we currently have 1.3 billion people. We're going to be 2.5 billion by 2050. So we already cannot deal with the 9 million deficit, and this deficit is going to continue to
multiply.
But to your question about entrepreneurship does not just exist in a vacuum. It needs a number of different pillars for it to flourish. Infrastructure. We have a $350 billion infrastructure gap. And let me make this even real. Recently in the news, we've seen a lot of challenges that Jumia has been facing, and it sparked a lot of conversations. And I was telling someone earlier that take Amazon in the US or Amazon in the UK. If you order my book on Amazon, for Amazon to get you my book in wherever you stay in London, the roads are paved.
Yeah.
The post office works. Electricity is regular, cheap, and reliable. The infrastructure is already there. And so the cost for Amazon to actually deliver this book to you in wherever you are is very low because the infrastructure is already there.
But if you now bring that same scenario to the continent.
Let's bring it here. The roads are not there. The connectivity and reliability, if you look at broadband penetration, like in Nigeria alone, fixed broadband penetration is still very low.
Yeah.
The cost of data
is
on
still
the
very
continent
high.
is still very high relative to global you know, where it is globally. Then you have unreliable power, if you have power at all. Then you have challenges with traffic,
local government issues, movement. And you know, another thing that we don't talk about in entrepreneurship is the capacity of the workforce. And I think that's very important because an entrepreneur may have a fantastic idea, may hire Nigerians, South Africans, Angolans, put them into that into their working environment. But there's a capacity issue with people who are being hired, and it does cost small and medium scale businesses money when it comes to either training them, they lose them, they leave, even having them being retrained if they're coming with bad habits that you don't want to infuse into your own business. So there's also a capacity issue of the workers we want to put into the entrepreneurship space. There's
a massive human capital challenge. In fact, for the book, I interviewed over 600 entrepreneurs across 45 African countries. And every single entrepreneur, not one did not mention among their top 3 challenges
staff,
funding, and human capital.
Wow.
Right? Human capital emerged as one of the biggest challenges. But this is where I am actually quite excited by some of the innovation I'm seeing in the education sector. And I'll mention some from private and public. Universities like Ashesi University in Ghana. You look at what Ashesi has. Ashesi has been set up to develop the next generation of ethical leaders. It's one of the only universities I know of where there are no invigilators in the exam room.
Because they're not needed. The idea is that you don't
need it. It's an honor code. And so, unsurprisingly, because of, they do a lot of critical thinking, so they've spawned a whole huge entrepreneurial ecosystem out of Ashesi. A lot of the alums are involved in entrepreneurial ventures and do very well. Fred Swanecker, Africa Leadership University, where Fred has come up with this idea to say, look, we cannot get to where we are
doing the things we're
doing. So he wants to build 25 universities across Africa.
Wow.
Because he says we need to train 3 million leaders.
Wow.
Right? And then on the public side, one of the entrepreneurs I interviewed in the book, David Senge. David is a genius polymath. I mean, from Sierra Leone. He won the highest after he did his PhD at MIT and won the highest award for using 3D modeling to invent a new way to make prosthetic limbs for amputees. Not just that, he's an artificial intelligence research scientist, Afrobeats artist, design. I mean, he's just
everything. A package.
His mentors, and I'm not joking. His mentors on speed dial include President Barack Obama and Bill Gates. So when the new president of Sierra Leone, His Excellency Bio, got into power, he called David, who was doing extraordinary things in the social entrepreneurship field. And he first appointed him as the country's first ever Chief Innovation Officer. Wow. And as of last week, David is, in addition, Minister of Education.
Wow.
And David has dreadlocks.
Please, if we start that conversation, right? I might mention somebody like SARS. I might have to divert into certain things, you know.
No,
but let's bring this back into entrepreneurship. We're seeing this generation, and you're mentioning people who for some would be outliers in this conversation.
Yeah.
And they're doing it in spite and despite the environmental factors that are at play for them. But how do we scale this up, and how do we have governments involved? Because one of the areas we're also lacking in entrepreneurship is making sure that women have an adequate chance, they have equal access. And that's why many people are very, very happy with what Akinwumi Adesina, president of the African Development Bank, is doing in terms of bringing about a policy and a program that is going to incentivize banks across the continent to give more financing to women. So how are we failing there, and why do we continue to fail there?
I'm glad you brought up women. Look, it was very important for me and for Bibi, my publisher, to achieve gender parity in telling the story of African entrepreneurship, right? For a number of reasons. One, we have the highest rate of female entrepreneurship in the world at 27%.
Yes.
The UK is like 6%. So we have a massive asset. It's not just a moral or social issue. It's also an economic issue. In fact, research shows that of every incremental dollar in the hands of a man, 30 cents get reinvested in the family, because men will go and buy beer and do things.
I think you might need to raise your voice.
But in the hands of a woman, 90% of it gets reinvested in the family. Health, nutrition, education. And so if you're looking
Which raises the socio-economic prospects of the family and the society around them.
But now look at the issue. Let's look at funding, okay? IFC put out a report that said, unlike what people say that women are not looking for the opportunities, 50% of all the applicants, accelerators, incubators, women. Of those accepted, 15% are women. Of those who receive funding post-Series A, only 5% are women. So there is a gendering of the inequality that we have to accept. Even the way we talk about entrepreneurship has embedded notions. There's androcentrism that's in there.
I agree.
The way we describe a successful entrepreneur sounds very masculine.
Yes, it does.
Right? And so there's a way in which we smuggle these notions of gender into our very understanding of success and leadership and entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
And it's harmful.
But then when you look at it, the statistics don't bear that out.
They don't.
All right, I want us to take a quick break. And you have mentioned that there are some countries getting it right. So we've looked at some of the issues around those who are not getting it right. But I want us to talk about who's getting it right when we come back, and what are the lessons other African countries can learn from them. Entrepreneurship is the future. It's the only way we're going to power the economy here on the continent. And when we come back, Sangu talks about his book, Making Futures, Young Entrepreneurs in a Dynamic Africa. Stay with us. This is still Business Edge right here on News Central. Our conversation on entrepreneurship continues, and now we'll get into Sangu's book, Making Futures. I want to take this quote very quickly, which says, entrepreneurship, if well managed, can create more jobs on the continent and increase the middle class, which is essential in sustaining economic growth. Now, part of your book also takes a look at some of these issues as well. As you said earlier, you spoke to over 600 entrepreneurs, and they shared their experiences with you. But before we get into more details of the book, I asked earlier, who is getting it right? And I already feel like I have an inkling of the answer you're going to give me, and then how can the rest of us learn from this country?
So I'll answer that with a story, okay? I was one of the earliest investors in Andela, and I still serve on its advisory council. And selfishly, I wanted Andela to set up its tech hub for Africa in Ghana. So, you know, I got the senior folks in Accra, set up meetings, presidency, all the relevant places. My people disgrace me. Hey. Well. I mean,
it wasn't your village people.
Oh, they disgrace me. Oh, they disgrace me. They disgrace me.
Wow.
I mean, and I always say that you will think that government, and that's why I wanted to use Ghana and not even use Nigeria, because I'm very familiar with Nigeria. I actually have more investments in Nigeria than any other African country. You will think our governments wake up every day and say, how can I frustrate business?
So I'm not the only one who's had this thought.
Let me contrast that experience. So when that happened, in fact, I was so embarrassed.
Wow.
I called my friend Claire Akamanzi, she's in the cabinet of Rwanda. She's the chief executive officer of the Rwandan Development Board. So they went over to Rwanda. Let me show you the difference. Rwanda said, what can we do to make sure you do it here? 7-year tax holiday. Let's help you get the land to set up the campus here.
We'll do the infrastructure for you.
And then on top of that, they said, so you want to invest, X million dollars. How many engineers will that do? This amount? No, let's double it. We'll match it.
Wow.
You can set up a company with everything you need in less than 1 day, within a matter of hours in Rwanda. Okay? There's a sense in which the policy environment is very much geared towards how can we make this place conducive
for business.
Right? How can we ensure that businesses want to come here and will flourish here?
So this leads me to a question that has to sort of go back to some of the conversation we had earlier about those individuals who are in spite of and despite of. So what we're seeing, and from this example you're giving me, regardless of what hundreds of thousands of individuals do, unless African governments are awake, are on board, are alive and ready for their responsibilities when it comes to the policies and the enabling environment around entrepreneurship, we'll be getting successes here and there, but we won't be getting the kind of success we need. Absolutely.
In fact, someone asked me, who did you write this book for? Right? And I told them, I said, lots of different people, but the first people that I hope would read it are leaders in government. I've always said this, while entrepreneurship offers huge promise to help us solve job creation problems, we cannot out-entrepreneur our way out of bad governance.
Very true.
We cannot. There's no amount of entrepreneurial excellence or innovation that can solve bad roads. That can solve
a lack
corruption.
of healthcare, a lack of investments in education.
Those are some of the basics that we need to get right. And before we even talk about water, access to water and sanitation, which, by the way, kills more children across the continent.
Infant mortality.
Than malaria and HIV combined.
So let's talk a bit about your book now. So you profile the story of about 17 entrepreneurs working in different industries across the continent, and you went through about 600 or more entrepreneurs to sort of come to these 17. And you speak of the continent's vast geography, nascent markets, low regional integration after it's coming. We don't know how much change that will be. And of course, knowledge markets as nuances in this Africa Rising narrative. And we've been hearing this Africa Rising, Africa is coming narrative for a number of years now. How are some of these issues being addressed? And what do you think are really the realities towards achieving entrepreneurial success across the continent?
So, it's a couple of funny things. One is you have Africa Rising, and then you have this hopeless Africa narrative. And both of those narratives, I think, flatten the dynamic reality of
it doesn't make us 3D.
It doesn't make us 3D. And in fact, let me unpack that even more. When we speak of Africa, what do we mean? When I was doing this book, I specifically went to 45 African countries because I realized, and we are guilty of this, those of us especially who are in Africa.
Africa is a country.
Africa is a country. We'll sit in Lagos. You've not even been to Kano and other places. You sit in Lagos and say, in Africa, in which Africa? What have you seen? On what authority are you speaking for 1.3 billion people? And so there's a way in which we need to exercise humility when we talk about Africa because it's 54 countries and 1.3 billion people. And in fact, the day it hits me that we are not all the same was when I was in Kenya and I said, the first time I was in Kenya, I said, let me have some local African food. They brought the food, I tasted it. I said, no, I want African food. They said, this is, I said, but listen, there's no spice. We are not the same. We're just not the same.
That's the West African in you.
I said, we're not the same. But you see, I'm glad you brought up the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We need to be able to open up our markets. One of the toughest things for me in doing the research was just traveling. With the African passport, it was harder for me to travel
in between African countries than to leave the continent and go elsewhere.
We need to open our borders, and I hope the Nigerian government is listening and they'll open the border because this is, this closed border thing is it's bad economic policy. If you look at economic
there are many
history,
who would not agree.
It's bad economic policy, and on top of that, it also does not augur well for regional and continental integration, right? We cannot talk about, free trade within the African continent when we don't even have free movement of people.
Yeah.
Right? We really need to seriously remove those roadblocks.
I think you'll have to come back and have a conversation on that, because we had a conversation on that recently, and there were those about talking about the rice issue, arms importation as well, security coming into play for the borders being closed. But coming back to entrepreneurship as we start wrapping this up, what particular story or individual or even a situation in the journey, because it's not a one-day thing.
Yeah.
Many people want to become an entrepreneur today, and tomorrow they have customers and they're selling out to everywhere. But what particular journey stood out for you in the research of this book and looking through this and really sort of finding a story that could be shared across the 54 countries and is something that every single African may find something that resonates with them?
So for me, that's the story about resilience. And it's encaptured powerfully in the personal story of Farida Bedwe. So Farida, who I profile in the book, she was born with cerebral palsy, right? And in our part of the world, we simply do not have, we're not friendly to people who live with disabilities.
The families don't have the knowledge, the healthcare system doesn't have the support structures.
You even go to buildings, we don't even have the right sort of ramps, and I mean, it's very, very, the discrimination that people living with disabilities face is huge. In spite of all those challenges, Farida rose and has now co-founded a tech company that's now the largest software for microfinance institutions.
Wow.
Right, and she's just a force of nature. World Economic Forum named her Young Global Leader. She just published a book and a comic about a heroine that lives with cerebral palsy.
I've seen it, yes.
I mean, she is so extraordinary, and to me, I love her story because, in spite of our challenges, she is a powerful symbol for the resilience and the optimism of the African youth when given opportunity.
And that's a fantastic note to end it on. We'll definitely have Sangu back. There's so much more conversation to be had concerning entrepreneurship and the African youth, and of course, making the future, looking at how Africa can benefit from that. Sangu, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolutely fantastic conversation. All right, guys, we'll wrap things up with NC4 to watch, and let's get straight into it. South Africa's Eskom makes profits in first half. Now, South Africa's struggling state power firm Eskom made a surprise $88.3 million profits in the first half of this financial year, roughly double the profit it made during the same period last year. Could this be a new trend? We have to wait to find out. The Bank of Kigali quarterly pre-tax profits up 58.9%. BK's third quarter pre-tax profit rose 58.9% to 14.6 billion Rwandan francs, helped by growth in its loan book. Third, Egypt's parliament reappoints Amir as central bank governor. The parliament has reappointed, or rather approved the appointment of the central bank governor, Tariq Amir, for a second four-year term, a sign that Egypt's policies will continue after he oversaw a 3-year IMF economic reform program. And Kenya welcomes Chinese firms in bid to boost industrial capacity at Nairobi Trade Show. Scores of Chinese companies gathered in the Kenyan capital Nairobi for a 3-day trade fair. The China-Africa Industrial Capacity Cooperation Expo is focused on China's role in Kenya's economic pivot towards the manufacturing sector. And that's it on the show. You can head to www.newscentral.africa for more great business content. And until next time, I'm Tolulokwe Adileru Balogun. Do continue making business-wise and financially savvy conversations. And one of them, stick here, right here on News Central.